Hi, I'm Moira Bateman. Thanks so much for being here. I explore ideas of cloth and memory by leaving silk in the lakes, bogs, and rivers of Minnesota. I didn't begin my textile career working as a fiber artist. I began as an artist who worked with earth, plants, and land. I began my artistic work with the land art and landscape architecture. My work is centered around conversations with ideas of place, site-specific constructions, and work that unfolded materials such as dirt, wood, clay, and importantly, plants as gardens, crops, or wild habitat. I sought to explore and describe concepts of wilderness and waterways, as well as ideas of toxicity inflicted on the earth, mothering and nurturing, as well as growth and caretaking more broadly. The chair I made here of soil from my grandmother's garden, which was located in a Minneapolis neighborhood impacted by the Como toxic Superfund vapor site, where toxic vapors seep from the soil into basements. In 2011, I began exhibiting work inspired by the author and playwright Patricia Aiken's story, The Hungry Girls. The Hungry Girls is a fable of the grotesque. In their insatiable hunger, the giantesses consume everything in sight, and especially dirt. And once pregnant, the daughters they eat their way out of their mothers to be born. In the story, the giantesses fight over a single nightgown, and this garment became the focus of my work. Significantly, this is when I fell in love with working with cloth. I manipulated each giant dress with markings of rips, holes, and exaggerated hand stitching, which attempts to repair the gashes. Markings on cloth have continued to describe conditions in my work. After the Hungry Girls, my natural inclination was to take cloth back out into the landscape with me. I have come to think of the earth and specifically the rivers and watersheds of Minnesota as my collaborators. I create assemblages from silk that has been stained with waterway sediments. For my textile abstractions, I leave silk to soak for weeks, months, or years. In the waters, mud, and sediments of rivers, lakes, and bogs throughout Minnesota. Sediments carried in the waters of these locations dye the silk and imbue the cloth with the place itself. A detail from the last slide showing the waxiness, translucency, stain patterns, and embedded wrinkling. After I retrieve the silk, I cut it and place the cut shapes into patterns, which I join together with wax to preserve and transform the silk into a skin-like, large-scale cloth assemblage. As an abstractionist, my hope is that the organic shapes, earth colors, stains, and textures of my assemblages evoke a strong sense of place, as well as the movement and condition of water and time. These assemblages have sought to represent the form of diatoms and other lake and wetland organisms. Additionally, I brought iron as a material into my work. When combined with the natural tannins of leaves and bark, iron will create a black color on cloth, which I use to create contrasting abstractions. For my McKnight Fiber Artist Fellowship work, I created 2 exhibitions. On the left side of the screen at Textile Center, etudes, watersheds, bogs, kayaks, and on the right side of the screen at Form and Content Gallery, located in downtown Minneapolis, bog etudes. This is a view of the exhibition at Textile Center. My work is to the left through the door in the Mary Giles Gallery, on the right and left sides of the lobby in the foreground, and at the far end of the hallway above the double doors in the distance. For these exhibitions, I worked with ideas of assemblage and what I call deassemblage. I built up pieces with layering and stitching, and I cut holes and deconstructed other pieces. I explored iron-rich bog mud and tannins, which created a variety of hues, including these surprising pink and purple tones in the foreground. and inside the Mary Giles Gallery. These are made with piece silk, thread, bog mud dye, bog mud, and wax. Here's a close-up for the larger piece from the last slide. A deeply cut piece hangs from the ceiling. It's almost like seaweed or kelp growing upright in a lake. The purple, blue, gray in the foreground with the deep brown behind it. And I made a kayak for my mother, my partner in bog hopping, cloth submerging, and other adventures. I can still visualize her hands showing me the magic of how to make a stitch and tie a knot when I was very little. The kayak's patchwork, its endless hand stitching and knot tying were cathartic and in memory of her. And the view from below the kayak, to me, it seems to be peacefully floating through a lake. This is back in the main hallway at Textile Center. The piece high up over the double doors at the back of the hall is 10 feet wide. The tannin and iron, blue, black, and holes, to me, are like the moon reflecting on a lake at night. These dark markings and holes come from this cloth resting at the bottom of a lake for an entire year. The blue-black comes from the addition of iron, and then it is layered with undyed piece silk. Patchwork and stitching, layering, and assemblage. An abstraction assemblage with contrasting light and dark tones, this time on a stretcher frame, a reference to that tradition in abstract oil paintings. A detail of layers and hand stitching from the last slide. A larger assemblage at 73 by 53 inches. With extensive layering and days of hand stitching. Again, a last overview at Textile Center. Here's the companion exhibition, Bog Etudes, at Form and Content Gallery in downtown Minneapolis. This installation was intended to be powerful, to represent landscape, the land, the water, the waterways, the bogs, as powerful, as important. And so to be powerful in that way, these panels are large for this space. And their placement commands the space along the center axis line. But as you get closer, they are also fragile, as thin as paper, full of holes. The views through the holes from one panel to another are ever changing as one moves one's eyes and body around the work. It becomes immersive in that way. This piece to the right of the axis point is a contrast in form and substance, spidery and complex. A close-up reveals the subtle changes in color and remnants of bog mud. And on the left-hand side of that same axis point, a solid form with a single central gash cutting it almost through. A detail of the worn edge of that center gash. And so the installation is meant to be powerful, fragile, immersive, with endless views of shapes and holes and layers. A photo of me taken by my mother at Lost Lake Peatland, one of my most favorite wild places. Ultimately, I hope for my work to tell of the complex story of these wild places. They hold much of the biodiversity remaining on Earth. Protecting and preserving this biodiversity is an essential component to facing climate change and keeping Earth hospitable to life. Here are all the ways to be in touch with me. It's just always basically my first and last names on any platform, and Linktree has all the links and contact info. And finally, thanks for everybody today. And so much thanks to the photographers, Rick Svera and Peter Lee, who made everything beautiful, my fellowship partner, Blair Treuer, the Textile Center and Tracy Crum for fellowship support and administration, the visiting critics, Jenny Sorkin, Julie Bargman, and of course, Michelle Miller-Fisher, and very importantly, the McKnight Foundation and their fellowship program. Thank you so much.
Moira, thank you. We are going to move right into Blair Treuer's presentation, so you're set to go, Blair.
All right, first, I just have to say how honored I am to be here as a McKnight Fellow, to have so much support from the Textile Center, and to be in conversation with these two incredible women. It's a career highlight for me for sure, so thank you so much. I'm a storyteller who came into my craft in an unusual way. My children's participation in a Native American ceremony required me to make blankets as part of their offering. It was the only contribution I could make as a non-Native, so I poured everything I had into those offerings. Instead of square patterns, I pictorially depicted the Ojibwe names that my children were gifted when they were born. After a decade of creating blankets for private spiritual ceremonies, I transitioned to creating portraits for public display. I'd first like to share a few images of my previous work that played a large role in shaping the foundation for this exhibition, titled Becoming: The Transition from Childhood to Womanhood. The goldfinches are constant in my work and represent Ojibwe cultural heritage, specifically the understanding my family has about who they are, where they come from, and what their purpose is while they're here. My youngest daughter doesn't internalize her struggles. She doesn't see the darkness that surrounds her because she carries the light inside her and she knows it. At my son's first kill feast, I try to ceremonially feed him the deer he harvested. He refuses me and says, "No, I'm thinking of the children who have no food." I try again and he says, "No, I'm thinking of the elders who can no longer hunt." I try again and he says, "No, I'm thinking of my community and everyone who's supported me throughout my life." I feed him again and he finally accepts it. He is told that he has just changed his life and become a man. When you come into abundance, whether that's harvesting food or money, you should think about children in need, elders in need, and the well-being of your community. That's what it means to be a man. And that has me questioning what we are communicating about manhood in mainstream society. Being in this family, my third eye is being opened. My portraits depict what I now see. My self-portrait is my central thesis. It's about the cocktail of both hope and despair that I feel as a mother and wife in this family. I'm of Scandinavian descent, but I don't even know what that means to me. I feel like an orphan. I didn't realize how much I lost until I saw that my husband and children had so much. But I have hope. The antlers are on my head as if to say there is something special about me too. I can't see it, but I can feel it, as though it's within my very bones, passed down from my ancient tribe too, and someday I'll know how to use it and be empowered by it. I created a mini-series titled The Female Body. On the left is a portrait expressing my acceptance of my own body. The goldfinch emphasizes both nature and the naturalness of my body and how delicate that state of acceptance is. On the right is a portrait of my mother. I'm so grateful she said yes to being my muse. With this portrait, I'm addressing what it's like to age as a woman in today's society, in a state that we as a collective don't celebrate aging or see it as beautiful. But what if we did? The third portrait in this series is of my youngest daughter. Just the thought of portraying her body as a suggestive nude made me really uncomfortable. And I created this video to express all my thoughts and feelings about her body. It wasn't until I created that video that I began to see myself as an art activist. With my latest body of work, I was captivated by the ceremonial rite of passage my daughter went through as a Native American when she got her moon, her first menstrual period. She was celebrated as sacred. The first half of this exhibition shows her playing pretend by the light of the moon. This portrait is her pretending to become a flower as she paints petals on her arm and a bee wearing wings. She wears feathers on her arms to become a bird and paints scales on her legs to become a fish. Night after night, she attempts to transform, and yet despite her beliefs, no real magic occurs. The portrait on the left is titled, "She Despairs in Darkness with the Monsters," and we see her struggle, the internal conflict between fantasy and reality, childhood and adulthood. In the next portrait, her grandmother validates her imaginative mind, asking what she has learned by playing pretend. The lessons are brilliantly colored, representing the newfound clarity of her enlightened mind. To never lose sight of those most vulnerable, a lesson from the birds. To trust and be trusted and recognize that you're not alone, a lesson from the wolves. To turn towards warmth and light and self-protect in the cold and in the dark, a lesson from the flowers. To entertain multiple points of view, a lesson from the fish. To recognize that others rely on your strength, your grounding, your growth, and your support, a lesson from the trees.
Hope for healing if you're willing. Hope for healing if you're willing. Hope for healing if you're willing. Hope for healing if you're willing.
She explores her body and she finds that she has indeed changed. And so she receives the lessons from the grandmothers. You are a sacred being. Your blood is sacred. No one has the right to harm you or control you. No one has the right to deny your sanctity. And bearing witness were the fathers and brothers and uncles and grandfathers, the community as a whole, and they all believed. I include this notion of bearing witness because that's what I experienced at my daughter's ceremony. And it was very powerful for everyone in attendance. We come to realize that all of these lessons are attributes of womanhood and of femininity. These portraits express and celebrate the value of femininity, its relevance to the health and well-being of a society, and elevates feminine expressions of leadership. Though this series explicitly discusses and portrays the female body, it is essentially proposing that our bodies, meaning every body, male, female, transgender, non-conforming, are sacred, and no one has the right to deny our sanctity. In a world that insists that power, relevance, significance, and worthiness is something you earn, cultivate, or fight for, my work proposes that it's something within you, simply because you exist. You are a sacred being. I want these portraits to inspire more intentional and meaningful cultivation of healthy cultural norms and experiences around valuing our bodies, especially with regard to how we express these values to our children. This final portrait portrays my daughter as a fancy shawl dancer, and each of the animals in her story are depicted around her and within her regalia. I also want to say that I am aware of issues regarding cultural appropriation, and I will not shy away from that conversation. With this exhibition, I am not trying to teach people about Ojibwe culture. Instead, I'm asking that we in mainstream America reflect on our own cultural norms. With this portrait specifically, I'd also like to say that it is really important that my children see me celebrate their cultural heritage and their identity. I am from rural America, which is very red politically. So it is also really important to me that my community see me celebrate the non-white parts of my children and invite others to join me in celebration. This portrait is titled, "You Are the Medicine." Thank you so much.
Blair, thank you so much. We are going to move on to Michelle Miller-Fisher's presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for having me, Tracy. And Blair and Moira, I can't wait to be in conversation with you in a few minutes. Those are fantastic talks. It's been so lovely being a part of studio visiting with you and getting to know your work better. So thank you very much for having me as your interlocutor tonight. Before we get started and I begin a conversation with you, and hopefully we get lots of great questions from the audience too, I wanted to share with you and with the audience a little bit of where your work took me when we studio visited together. And these are just a few references, but I felt they would be a nice way to begin our conversation. Whenever you go visit an artist as a curator, you come away knowing their work and think about it uniquely, but you can't help thinking about the kind of orbit and cosmos in which you place their work. And so, Moira, when I was thinking about your work in particular, I thought of these three artists that I'm about to share. And of course, in conversation, you can both tell me, no, this is absolutely not where I think my work can be placed. I should tell a small story. Many of you may know Andy Goldsworthy's work, a British sculptor from the United Kingdom who works primarily outdoors and with natural materials. Of course, I thought about his work when I thought of your work, Moira, thinking about working with nature directly as you do with waterways, working with water as Andy certainly does, the ephemerality of his work and the durational nature of him being out in space, and so too your work, both your material and yourself being out in nature. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Glasgow, I went and asked my tutor if I could get some work experience. I was a security officer at the University Museum. It was the only job that paid. And my tutor said, oh, there's an artist about an hour and a half away. You'll have to get up at 5 a.m. to go down to visit him on his farm, but he needs a helper. And it turned out to be Andy. So I know his work intimately, and I really did feel this wonderful symbiosis or synchronicity when I found out about you and your work, Moira. I was lucky enough to work at MoMA for a couple of years, about 5 or 6 years ago. And this is on the works I fell in love with from their collection. Eva Hesse, a German artist who died very young, in her mid-30s from a brain tumor. So she doesn't have a very large oeuvre. But what she does have, again, really reminded me of your work. She was a pioneer in using very unusual materials, plastic, latex, materials actually we might have thought at the time would have a better durationality than they did. Certainly we're now dealing a lot with conservation issues in museums with artists who have used these types of materials. They simply don't look the same as they did in the 60s and 70s, even if we're able to think about putting them in cold storage and treating them in the best way possible. And so I really felt, again, this sort of real interest in sort of a material science almost, thinking about how far and how hard you can push materials and how to be in dialogue and conversation with them really reminded me again, Moira, of your work. And then finally, a contemporary artist still very much alive, Julia Lohman. I had the great pleasure of working with her on an exhibition a couple of years ago that I did at the Philadelphia Museum of Art called Designs for Different Futures. Julia had come through the Royal College of Art program. She's another German, so I've gone totally European in your direction. Moira, I have 3 very American artists to share with you, Blair. But Julia's work I love, and she's part of a group of artists who are looking at the possibilities, the design potential and the aesthetic potential of seaweed. She came through the Royal College of Art program in London, probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And while she was there, her program was in conjunction with the Victoria and Albert Museum. What an amazing collection to be able to come through as a graduate student. So lucky her. But she got offered a fellowship there, and she set up amongst all of their other departments, architecture, design, sculpture, medieval art, she set up the Department of Seaweed. And so for a good month or so, maybe a bit more, she was in residence at the museum, and she brought this material into public discussion. And I felt, again, this sort of interest in materiality, and not least some of the images that you showed us just now, Moira, of the way in which your work falls almost like seaweed does, or takes on some of the formal qualities. It really reminded me there was a sort of a synergy there as well. Blair, I love both you and Moira's work for so many reasons. I really love the way in which you ask us to look at images of people coming of age, and to really not shy away from, I mean, I remember when I was that age, every age is a hard age, but that's a hard age to be. It's a really hard age to get society to take you seriously, to be protected, but simultaneously respected, to be able to be out in the world, even as you are sort of figuring out who you are in the world. I also think it's a subject matter that until fairly recently as well, has not always been taken seriously in the art world. I did a project, as you know, called Designing Motherhood, Things That Make and Break Our Births. And I feel very strongly about the ways in which we might bring all parts of our biography into art making and into, you know, general conversation. And so when I was thinking about your work, I really went back to this photograph, which we're lucky enough to have at the MFA. It's called Vinland by Sally Mann. Sally Mann, born in and still is in Lexington, Virginia. And thinking about the ways in which her children, Virginia, Emmett, and Jessie, so 2 daughters and a son, met the world in their kind of coming of age years. And these were images that were heavily criticized at the time. People didn't take them seriously because of the aforementioned reason. Motherhood was a subject not to be spoken aloud in public. And I know you both as artists really shy away from that, or you refuse that interpretation. You are very, very happy and indeed proud to take on aspects of that biography, whether it's about your own mothers, whether it's about your mothering, whether it's about mothering more generally. But when I thought about your work, I really thought about the legacy that Sally Mann has left us, at least in her large format camera work and photography, of broaching that conversation and doing so with a certain fearlessness and a disregard for naysayers and critics, which is, I think, a very good way to be in the world. I couldn't help but think also when I look at your work of Faith Ringgold's story quilts. I was one of the lucky museum goers who got to go to the new museum in New York a couple months ago, when she had a really big retrospective. And of course, Faith Ringgold works across many different media, but one of the media I think that she's most well known for is quilting. And again, I mean, I think you both make your work, or your work comes in some sense from family. It's a family affair in a way, and so too is Faith Ringgold's work. So her story quilts, very well known. Ringgold, born in New York City, still alive in her 90s, I believe. So one of these towering artists who's seen so much and sort of defies movement because she's just been around for so long. But she takes deeply personal narratives of her own family. She has a story quilt series, for example, that I love in particular. I think it's from the 1980s, where it details the story of a trip that she got to take with her daughters to Europe. And there's pictures of them that she has created in fabric and paint of them visiting the Louvre and them visiting lots of different places. So kind of a family snapshot, but rendered in textiles and fiber. And so for me, these were very important works, not only for their formal affinities with your work, Blair, but also thinking about the ways in which she's a storyteller. She's interested in telling stories with her work. She does that through the inclusion of text, as you see in this particular example, but she does it also just from the ways in which her images evoke a desire in the viewer to see more. You see a portrait and you want to know more about what's going on. And then finally, I wanted to make a plug actually for an essay in a way, although it's also a really wonderful artist who I'm pointing out here, Mila Lederman-Ukele's part of the generation, same generation, if you know the artist Mary Kelly, and artists like them in the late 1960s, early 1970s, who, like many people still, had to juggle care work, in their case, care work for children, with becoming artists and retaining time in the studio. I always remember actually poignantly a generation before that, when I was at the Guggenheim, we had a wonderful exhibition of Louise Bourgeois' works, and she made her earliest works in the 1940s, these very tall, thin sculptures. She made them on the roof of her apartment in New York because she had to be home with her children. And so she had studio time when her children slept or they were eating or otherwise occupied. And she made tall wooden sculptures because she could take wood off the water barrels on other people's roofs. And that was the material that was right at hand for her. A generation later, Millar, Later-Manuchelis, Mary Kelly, many others were using the material that they had at hand too, and that was their children. So it was a collaborative process. And in the maintenance work series, Ukeles had many, many parts to it. But you see pictures just here, it's a tiny picture, but you can look online. The book itself was one I edited a while ago. I cannot claim this essay. It's a wonderful one, Making Art with Your Kids, Generation, Cooperation and Desire in Parent-Child Artwork of the 1970s. It was written by 3 fantastic colleagues of mine, including a dear friend, Meredith Brown, who used to be at the Met. But they make the point that a lot of artists, especially women artists, especially of that feminist movement, second wave feminism in the 1970s and early 1980s, really had to make hay with what was in front of them. So this is pictures of the artist dressing and undressing children coming in and out of the snow. I think in your area of the world, you can really relate to that probably right now if you have somebody in your life who cannot dress themselves and you need to help them. But she also looked at many other aspects of that parent-child relationship and figured out how that worked as a collaboration, much like Sally Mann did. It was a constant negotiation. It was a constant thinking of the ethics of this, of how to get it right. And of course, with parenting, there is no right. There's just a keep going forward or keep moving into the next day. But there's this wonderful history of feminist art making that I think for me very much resonated with your work as well, Blair. So I will stop sharing there. Those were 3 artists that just really kind of, I came to mind, and you can tell me in the course of the conversation just now, both if I really got it wrong. But I wanted to start, and I'm going to pull my questions up so I have them next to me as we move along. I wanted to start with a question for you both, and I think I'll start with questions that relate to both of you first and then drill down a little bit individually. I wanted to ask a more kind of short-term or near-term question, because we're here to talk about, in part, the fellowship that you have both had with the McKnight and with the Textile Arts Center. And so I wanted to ask what the biggest change over time has been in the work that you have made in the last year. Like, what have been the epiphany moments for you in this time that you have spent in fellowship and in this particular conversation? So maybe, Moira, could I start with you? And then maybe somebody could unmute Blair and we'll ask Blair.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate the question. A lot has clicked in my mind during the work of the fellowship year, especially just how I work and how the work I've done over time, how it all fits together. For instance, I see a new continuity from the Hungry Girls all the way to Bog Etudes, the holes, how really the earth could be seen as mother, and we as the Hungry Girls are devouring our way through earth. But those holes that have really reappeared with Bog Etudes, I just saw this continuity, which was super cool.
And I wanted to ask, have you been able to show work in this kind of, as you say, continuity or series recently or ever, Moira? Like, has there been an opportunity to make something quite as sort of, I mean, both of your exhibitions are really beautiful, and Blair, I'll ask you a little bit more about what it means to bring these works together too, but have you had the opportunity to kind of have everything like this in one space, or in your case, Moira, 2 spaces?
I'm honestly not sure what you mean. Do you mean?
Have you had the 2 exhibitions that you have just now as part of the fellowship? It allows you to have this continuity of narrative. You have many, many works in one space, so you're really able to bring visitors into your practice in a way that is, you know, super exciting. I wish I could see it in person, but even from the images, it feels like a really rich way to be able to get inside an artist's practice. And so I'm wondering if this fellowship is maybe not the first time, but an important time that has afforded you that opportunity.
It's been terrific, and I loved being able to have the 2 venues, but I have had the opportunity to fill bigger spaces like this with my work before, especially with the Hungry Girls, with By Way of Water, which I showed in New York City at the Bowery Gallery. And I really love that. This is not the first time. It really does go back to the Hungry Girls, where it becomes really immersive, where the work has come off the walls and people walk into it. And so I love that.
Well, looks amazing. Blair, how about you? Is this, what have been the epiphany moments or the kind of real bounties of the last year in terms of your practice during this fellowship?
Yeah, well, with regard to, my studio time, the work that you see at the Textile Center, I started a couple years ago. So it took me 3 years to create all of those portraits. There's 27 portraits in that exhibition. And really what has changed for me with this fellowship is, I'm self-taught, like completely self-taught. And so prior to this fellowship, I felt like I was very much in my own cave. Like I didn't think about my relevance to the greater art discourse, my place in the world as an artist. I was so consumed by my own experience as a maker and just in that tunnel. And this fellowship has allowed me the privilege to speak to other professionals, which I didn't have access to before. So I not only do I feel like I'm finally not running around blind, like throwing myself at every opportunity because I don't know what I'm supposed to do. But I've had to start considering like my relevancy in this space. What am I contributing to the conversation of other people who who have strong voices in this field? And that has been really eye-opening for me and beneficial for me to start thinking about myself in that way.
I love that answer. You actually gave me a good segue into another question that I had. You are self-taught, as you say, Blair. I'd love to hear you both talk a little bit about people who have been important teachers for you. And teachers can certainly mean people in a classroom setting or somebody who, embodies or likes to have the term teacher used for them. But teachers come in all different forms and shapes and sizes. They're not always people either. But maybe Moira, I can start back with you. Who have been some of the most important teachers? And I would encourage you to, you can go back as early as you like. It doesn't have to be in your higher education that we're talking about either. It really is teacher in the broadest sense.
Yeah, thank you so much. The absolute most impactful teacher in my life has been Julie Bargman, a professor in my grad studies in landscape architecture at the University of Minnesota. She went on to teach at UVA, but my whole way of thinking about making, about landscape, and about art really came into focus through her impactful and all well-rounded teaching, her amazing studio critiques that I had in grad school. And the super, super cool thing is she was one of my formal visiting critics for the McKnight Fellowship. So this was just huge to me, just like coming full circle.
That's awesome. I think that is such a reminder. I'm doing a project just now on craft teaching across the United States. And the amount of time somebody tells me about an incredibly impactful teacher, and I always follow up with the question, do they know the impact they've had on you? Like, have you been in touch with them to tell them that? Because it's always the right time to say thank you to a teacher. And so that's such a lovely story that it's come full circle and that she was able to sit with you as a critic. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. How about you, Blair? In terms of being self-taught, that's definitely a way into a practice, but have there been important teachers for you in other senses?
Yeah. Well, I guess, first of all, I want to clarify that I am self-taught in every sense of the word. So like lots of fiber textile artists will say that they're self-taught, but they've been shown how to use their sewing machine by a caregiver, or they've at least attended YouTube University, to see like how things are made, and they benefit from the process and experience of other people. And I really came to this as like somebody who is in a room with a sewing machine and fabric and decided to experiment to see what I could do until it was made. But and so I can't think of like a single person that was influential, but I did take 2 art classes in college, and that experience was really impactful in my practice. And those 2 classes were Intro to Life Drawing, and that taught me how to sharpen my eye and about light. And then I took Intro to Painting, which helped me understand color. And those 2 experiences, just I felt like my creativity was able to explode with those 2 understandings.
Yeah, and I also, I mean, I don't want to put words in both of your mouths, so you can tell me if this is a fair question or not for you both. But as I'm listening to you both, and I know your work after being able to studio visit with you and keep in touch, I'm struck that your families, if not teachers, have been important inspirations for your work, or have certainly expanded the way in which you approach your practice in a way that I think can be within the realm of thinking of teaching in its expanded form. I loved that picture, for example, that was close to the end, or at the very end of your PowerPoint, Moira, taken by your mom. My mom is no longer with us, and I really treasure some of those moments and memories where you really have, a sense memory of a moment in time spent with somebody incredibly important. And you just showed us amazing pictures of many members of your family, Blair. They're absolutely integral to the stories that you're telling. And so I hesitate sometimes to ask this kind of question, especially with female artists, because it can be, it can be an oversharing that male artists sometimes are not asked to offer, or it can be a direction in the conversation that male artists are not asked. Although if they're my moderation subjects, they are always asked as well. But I'm wondering if you can tell me a bit more about the importance of your family structure to the work that you're doing. And I know, Blair, you've given us some of that in your talk. Maybe you can start us off, and then Moira, if you wouldn't mind telling us a bit about that from your perspective.
Yeah, my work wouldn't be created without the experience that my family is giving me. I never would have come to fabric if it wasn't placed in my path. And I can't think of anything that I want to celebrate more than the relationships I have with my children and my husband. And so, yeah, they're integral. And I think about that a lot. Like, if my life took a different course, I'd always been interested in art, but I needed to be on the journey that I found myself on to make work that's as meaningful as it is. I think I don't think I would feel as called to it. I think I would be grasping at straws because I would want to be a creative person, but it wouldn't feel so purposeful as it does right now.
Yeah, absolutely. How about for you, Moira, in terms of how family has become or is integral to the work that you do?
Yeah, thank you. Well, my mother is no longer with us, but when she went out to all these amazing places with me all over the state of Minnesota. And now my son and my daughter have done that with me. So just experiencing the natural world and having them with me on these journeys has been amazing. And I would say also the shift from my outdoor work and landscape architecture to my gallery work on the Hungry Girls was so influenced by that fantastical theater of the grotesque, the Hungry Girls. And the whole story was based on and talking about birthing and mothers and
Pregnancy and all
pregnancy. And I was very pregnant with my first child when I saw that. And I don't think it still would have been a very impactful theater production, but that combination was so impactful. My eyes were just huge watching it. So probably just the fact that I was pregnant when I saw that play could have a lot to do with how I even began making art about that whole thing, and how the whole trajectory of my work came from that.
Thank you both. I see some great questions coming up in the chat, and so we'll wait a moment before we get there. And I know Tracy will shepherd us there, but please feel free to add more questions if you have them in the audience. I'm going to change tack a little bit now. We had a really good discussion actually in our pre-meeting about process, about the act of making, about technique. And we talked about which parts of process are interesting to you, parts that you like to talk about in an artist talk, for example, or parts that are integral to being able to explain your work. And then which parts are like totally uninteresting, and which parts also feel kind of very personal and not for sharing publicly. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about this idea of process and technique, where you really feel that you want to dive into it and where you don't. There was a sort of a side conversation we were having about the term craft, which is often connected to technique and skill, etc. Although I think it also has conceptual heft. I'm biased because I'm a curator of craft. So I wondered if you could both talk a little bit about process and technique, where it shows up in your work and you want to share it, and where it shows up in your work and you don't, and the reasons why. And so Moira, maybe I could start with you.
Sure. Well, I think I find all parts of my work very interesting, all my materials, all my processes, and that's really sort of on purpose, basically because I want to enjoy my everyday, day-to-day working. The most important part of the process, though, is the experimentation. So combining elements and creating a new thing. And the exact materials, the exact processes, those intricate details of the making, I do keep to myself. They are actually things that have just evolved through trial and error, and also they are just not perfect. They are not actually fully formed in any way. They're still evolving, so that is part of that too. And then regarding craft, I do think of craft as a traditional practice that has exact techniques that are meant to be mastered in a certain way. And I don't think of myself that way because I like exploration so much, and I like trying new things that are imperfect and don't have rules or formulas. I don't think I would like making things that there's just a right way of doing it. It's almost like I rebel against that a little bit.
Good. Good. I'm glad that you do. Absolutely. Because it gives us the beautiful work that you make. How about you, Blair, in terms of ideas of process and technique? Where is that of interest to you, and where is it like just not a conversation that is productive?
Yeah, it is really hard for me to show up for conversations about process and materials. And a lot of quilters especially want to talk to me about my process and materials and machines. And to be honest, I don't know when I've used cotton versus linen versus poly, like I don't pay attention. I don't care. I don't know brands of fabric or thread. I don't know what all of the buttons on my machine do. So when people want to talk to me about those types of things, I feel like a child at the adult table. Like I don't know how to contribute to this conversation because that part has never been important to me. And I get all of those questions, and lots of quilters especially have asked, if they could learn my technique, and I don't know the terms that they use. And I know that they're asking because quilting is generally fairly formulaic. Like lots of people teach how to turn your photograph into a pattern that you can then, create a quilt with. And I don't operate that way. I really operate like a painter, and I feel like I don't even know how to explain to you how I come to this because it's so intuitive for me. I would have no idea how to teach you. So that's a really hard conversation for me to have with people, but so many people want to have it. And regarding craft too, I feel like, I use craft to describe myself. But I also feel like craft is about the foundation of art, like it's about techniques, it's about skills, it's about the transition of skills to other people, learning and collective, things like that. And I feel like art is the manifestation of an individual's creative mind. And so we all need that foundation, right? Those skills, but I'm not that interested in talking about that part because I'm too excited about the individual's creative mind, I guess.
Yeah, and I love that very much about both of your work, that it absolutely is. I mean, it feels as if you couldn't make, you wouldn't be. It really feels for you both that this is almost a sort of an active breathing. I want to make space for other people's questions, so I'll just ask you a few more and then I'll see if there's any in the chat that Tracy wants to share with us. And this is maybe where I'll ask some individual questions. Moira, when I did my studio visit with you, one of my questions, it may well have been a dumb question, but it was one I really, really wondered about, because your textiles are submerged for a really long time. It's not as if you dip them in and then, you know, it's out again in a couple minutes. Sometimes it's weeks, sometimes it's months. It can be up to a year, maybe longer. And I wondered how you kept your textiles safe over time, how you know, what happens? Have you gone back at a point in time and it just hasn't been there, or it's deteriorated way more than you thought it had? You're out in, you know, as you said, the wilds, in nature itself. What has the process been like in terms of that particular aspect of it, making sure that you do have something to come back to most of the time?
Yeah, for a while now, I've been leaving cloth out in waterways in these sturdy, reusable, widely meshed bags that I tether to nearby root or a branch. I do have ideas about doing away with the bag and letting the cloth be more vulnerable to the elements, but I would need to accept that the cloth could get lost that way. And with the tethering and the bags, I've hardly ever lost anything. I think I have one missing bag up on a lake, a couple lakes in from the Gunflint Trail, and now it's been there for 2.5 years. So I do have dreams of finding it back on that lake, but the tether had been just snapped, almost like a snapping turtle or a beaver. And there was a group of them, but two of them had been snapped off, and I found one floating, and the other one I never found. So it would be very exciting to find that.
Yeah, totally. I can imagine people like making a mental note to take out a kayak and see if they can find a piece of your work. I certainly did if I were so.
Yeah,
And then return it to you when they find it.
Yeah,
Of course,
Fern
I
Lake,
absolutely
so
meant that, Blair. Yes, yeah, absolutely returning it.
if you find it.
When we last talked in our studio visit, you talked a little bit about video elements of your work and about the ways in which you were thinking about new or different modes of presenting, really getting kind of granular actually in terms of the ways in which you thought about the hanging hardware for your work, for example, because being very intentional about that offers different possibilities of effect in terms of the way that the textiles fall, which is incredibly important for the conceptual and formal elements of your work. And so I wondered, sort of thinking a little bit into the future about what comes next, can you tell us a little bit about future plans and thinking about those elements in particular, either video or thinking about ways of presentation? Do you have ideas that are sort of next steps for you?
I do. In terms of the video presentation, I have been working with a film student. And so far, we've been to the studio and the galleries, but we do plan on heading out into waterways together this summer. And so I'm super excited to document the places I go, the sounds, the poetry of that, because right now it's like I'm the only one enjoying that part of my work.
Yeah, I'm so excited for that. I want to see that work. I mean, I love the oeuvre that you have shared through the exhibitions for the fellowship, but my interest is really piqued by the idea of that sort of sensory experience, because when I think about your work, I think about the smell of waterways, the sound of the water, the experience of being able to go on those journeys. And so I will really be excited to see what comes of that. Blair, maybe you could answer a similar question. Actually, when we talked last, you were thinking about a new series that might look more directly at the male body. I loved that portrait of your son, Evan. And so it's not as if you haven't touched that before, but you were thinking about diving in a little bit more, thinking about aging as well. And so you also were talking, I see my notes here about embroidery, going on residencies, creating a book. Like, what are the things that sort of seem to be next steps for you?
Yeah. Well, I do feel like I'm at a crossroads right now with what I want to start next. There are two projects that are pretty important to me. with the work at the Textile Center, the final portrait, I actually envisioned that as like a 15 by 15 foot piece that, where the fancy shawl dancer and the animals escape the wall barrier, like making it much more sculptural, playing with things like embroidery and trapunto, and really like blurring the lines between painting, sculpture, installation, and costume, and just like learning a lot through that process. And I want to publish a book of this series. And so that's why I'm still pulled to creating that piece that I had envisioned in my mind, even though I didn't have time or space to include that in this exhibition. And I'm really not sure if it's wise for me to spend likely a year on one large scale piece without any confirmation that I will have a place to install it, display it, and photograph it for a book. If that's not lined up, I'm not sure that that's wise for me. But yeah, my next series that I want to do is large scale male nudes. And I want to primarily focus on bodies that are aged 40 to 80. I say bodies that have been lived in. I would like to push back against the god bod or, that version of maleness that is thrusted at us in society and even in classical art. There's a certain version of maleness. And I want to celebrate what a real human body looks like. And, technically I'm excited about how challenging that will be for me. Like the thought of like body hair, like all the things that are also photoshopped out of what we see with the body. So skin folds and wrinkles and veins and all of that richness of somebody's individual presence. I'm really excited to try to figure out how to depict that. And I want to sharpen my focus on realism. And with each of my muses, I'm going to include an interview with them about their relationship with their body. So I want the discussions to be about, male body image, masculinity, male sexuality, the male body's relationship to physical and sexual violence, real and imagined. I'm raising 5 sons. I want to have an honest look at manhood and honest conversations about what mainstream society, what those conceptions of manhood is. And I feel like, I just did a whole show expressing the kinds of conversations I want to have with my daughters about how to be empowered and safe and secure and love themselves in their bodies. And I've never even asked myself, what does that look like in supporting my sons?
Yeah.
What do they need to hear? What do they need to know? I don't even know what experience they're having out there in their skin and in their bodies.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly, I mean, I can imagine those portraits being incredibly fragile and vulnerable actually for the sitters. And it really excites me to think about the relationships that you will need to form with them and they will form with you in the making of those, just as your family as sitters have done as well. And it strikes me as really timely, Blair. There have been many conversations. I follow the news at home in the United Kingdom, but this news is widely applicable, I think, in many cultural scenarios. There's a real rise of for want of a better term, toxic masculinity that is incredibly prevalent because it is disseminated widely across social media. There are some well-known names of folks who have been sort of held up as men who espouse certain, as you say, ideals of manliness that don't necessarily suggest anything about vulnerability, about community, about family, about being able to love oneself as you are. And so I think it's a conversation that is, is people are trying to figure out ways to have that conversation, actually, I think, with young men in ways that allow them to express themselves, but also ask them to see themselves as part of social good and as part of a social compact. So it's a really live discussion. I'm really excited to hear where it goes. One of the follow-up questions I had for you both was, you've had this wonderful opportunity, and we've had a wonderful opportunity with the McKnight to be able to see your work really flourish in this particular capacity. If there were other opportunities out there, I always ask artists this: what opportunities do you wish you had, or did you wish you had, that don't yet exist but you want to manifest somehow? You answered it a little bit, Blair, in terms of 15 foot by 15 foot and somewhere to show it, and I think build it and they will come. But is there something else that you kind of wanted to manifest in terms of an opportunity? And Moira, for yourself as well, what are the opportunities you would really like to see out there for yourselves or for other artists like yourselves? And so Moira, maybe I can ask you first.
Okay, yeah. Something I'm very interested in doing is more connections with scientists doing environmental research, especially on bogs and peatlands around Minnesota. I just want to learn. I've worked before with lake water scientists, limnologists, and I learned so much, and it really impacted my work. And now I am especially interested in bogs, and hoping I can just learn as much as possible and spend as much possible time in bogs in the near future.
Well, this is a statement putting it out into the universe. So I hope there's either someone watching tonight or you are able to garner that collaboration, because yes, I can imagine it would be wonderful. Blair, how about yourself?
Yeah, so, I think that each of my portraits as an individual is meaningful and powerful on its own. But I do see myself as a storyteller. And so it is really important to me that that people get to experience the whole story. And, an example I have of that is with my first body of work. I did a portrait of each of my 9 children, my husband and myself. And in that series, the portrait of my oldest daughter is an expression of her decade-long struggle with drug addiction and bouts of incarceration. And placing that next to the portrait of my son, Robert, who dropped out of college to raise her children, and that in the context of all of the rest of our portraits in a healthy, loving family, really humanizes her portrait in a way that is much more difficult to do if it were standing on its own or if it were in some other group show. And I feel that way about the work that I have at the Textile Center too. Like, each piece is meaningful, but when you get to see the entire story, it's so much more impactful. And I've gotten so many messages, not just about the story that I'm telling, but that being in the presence of a room filled with my portraits feels like people say they can feel a force field of love, and that it's palpable, and that there is an energy exchange, and so many people have said these portraits feel alive when you're with them. And so I would love to be able to share that healing experience as much as possible, which in my mind means this body of work traveling to other communities as a whole, as an intact story that more people can experience in person. And to be honest, I didn't know when I first started creating that that's not how it works.
That's good though. And I feel like it makes me think about an opportunity like this evening. Artist talks are so important. I'm an art historian and a curator, and I often talk about artist works. I did it right at the top here, where I picked 3 artists which I really felt had resonance with your works, and I was able to speak about them. But it's a different thing when you get the artists themselves able to talk about it. And it's a delight always to be in conversation with artists, because although there's a place for an art historian, there's places for writers who can help offer extra context around making. There's nothing that beats being able to hear directly from the people themselves, who are the makers, the artists, the folks thinking about the work right from the beginning. And you're right, often a work will get plucked from an artist's oeuvre. It does something within the context of a group exhibition, or it does something as it comes into an acquisition in a museum collection. And that something can be related to the original intent of the artist, but it's not often synonymous. And so it's important to be able to document what you meant when you made, even if it's not always the way in which your work is received, because of course, when it goes out there in the world, it's, you know, everybody brings their own experiences to both of your work too. I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure that I check the chat and check in with Tracy to see if there are any questions. And I'm reading from the way.
It's Tracy. I'm gonna ask a question because I worked closely with both Moira and Blair this year, and you had very different approaches to your practices. Blair, you were completing the 27 or 20, I can't even remember the count now, pieces in a series that you had begun almost 3 years ago, and the fellowship allowed you to be able to do that and bring this narrative to fruition. Moira, you had a practice that you were surging ahead with, and I'm going to say in the end, you ended up doing something very different than what I thought you might present several months ago. And one of the questions in the chat was, can you talk, and this may be directed to Moira, and then maybe Blair, you can piggyback on that. Moira, talk about your process of building, creating, and then deciding how to install, hang, and exhibit the display of your large pieces, especially the more delicate ones. And those delicate pieces seem to be the newest work from your practice, just knowing what I have about what you've done. So can you talk a little bit about what happened in this process of discovery in terms of what you made for the exhibition and how it all came together?
Certainly, I would gladly talk about that. So I think what I had been working on for a number of years were the assemblages, the really layering, stitching, the pieces from By Way of Water, which I was displayed in New York in the Bowery Gallery. And just that work had been inspired by the work with the limnologists at the St. Croix Watershed Research Station. And that work was just moving ahead for a few years, since 2018, 2019, and then through 2020 and 2021. And then in 2022, working on everything for this McKnight Fellowship and the exhibitions. I continued to make assemblages that were these full beings, these put together pieces that were just really full, and these forms, these rounded and life forms that were originally based on the cells and the things in the water at a microscopic level. And then there just became a transition in like October of the recognition, I believe, of that continuity back to the Hungry Girls. And I just kind of on accident one day made a piece with a bunch of holes in it and just realized that connection back to Hungry Girls. And the piece just felt alive. It felt like something I just really needed to keep developing. And so really, other than a couple, 3 pieces at the Textile Center that are more assemblages with lots of layers and stitching, and the only holes are holes that had been created by water. Other than those 3 pieces, by about, I think, November 15th or Thanksgiving, everything else in both shows I created after Thanksgiving. So it just, once I kind of had this revelation of wanting to explore deassemblaging and cutting holes and taking away and having subtraction going on, it just took off. And so everything was made very, very quickly. I mean, I worked every day, obviously, at that point, but it felt really good. It just went very smoothly, and it just felt really good to make that work. Include the kayak not being that way. The kayak was also more of an assembly and layering, but I made that during the same time period.
Yeah, I just have to say that what I love about our shows being paired together is, you know, her huge pieces are missing holes. And if you look at my pieces up close, they're all made from pieces of fabric like this. And just, I just thought that that was so beautiful, how well our work complemented each other. At least in my mind, it really does. I think it's really exciting for people who get to walk through both spaces in the gallery that way.
Absolutely.
I want to make sure we had some other really great comments in the chat. Julie Miller was asking, and I think this one is for Blair directly, from an art activist perspective, how has your work impacted awareness around violence against Indigenous women? And maybe we can also expand that. I had a question as you were both giving your presentations this evening, asking more about just the politics of your work. I think you both have a very significant politics to the way in which you approach your practice. So maybe Blair, you can answer Julie's great question, and maybe you would both talk a little bit about the politics of what you do.
Yeah, so I didn't set out to like change minds or have a voice, or you know, that's never like what's going through my mind when I'm creating. But what I've experienced in showing all of the work I've ever made is that when I share my truth, people connect, and it's moving. People join the conversation. And so, you know, in sharing my honest feelings about my daughter's body in that video, I shared that on social media, and my social media was flooded with messages of appreciation, and like people called crying, and they're like, you know, they rallied behind me, and all I had to do was share my truth. And that's how I approach all of my work. Like, it's not scripted. I'm not thinking, this is what I care about, this is the story, how do I let people into my story? It's kind of been the other way around. It's more like, I'm internally working on this, and then I realize other people are too when I show them.
I think that's part of the power of being able to actually have a social media presence in this day and age. It is not the only way to connect, but especially over the pandemic, I think it certainly allowed me, when I couldn't go do studio visits, I couldn't go visit museum collections. It was a place where I could see work, but also I could understand some of the more vulnerable or intimate aspects of people's work, because that's often what is shared in that space. Moira, for you, I think about the politics of your work as it relates to environment, and real cognizance of the ways in which that's both such a rich and amazing part of our lives, but a resource that is and has been exploited. Is that fair to say that is a politics to your practice? That's something that you see as a political aspect of your work?
Absolutely. And really the main goal of my work in the end would be to raise awareness for these places and for the importance of protecting them and biodiversity. In my grad studies, I had a dual concentration in landscape ecology and studio art, and hugely important is biodiversity, of course. And it's been a huge interest of mine since then, not only in animals and critters, but in native plants of prairies, wetlands, and forests, and how they help the health of our planet and help with climate change. Interests of mine back then were reclamation and restoration, aiming to bring back these diverse plant communities to land where they would have naturally occurred, and into as any prairie or any other land ecotype as natural and functional as possible of a landscape. And so those are interests in mine, but, you know, obviously preserving the original landscapes is the highest priority. And just getting information out there about these places with my work, giving the places almost like a voice, like in Bog Etudes at Form and Content Gallery, the 6 panels in the center, they felt alive, like they had just risen out of the bog, and their strength and presence there, I felt like the bog had its moment in the gallery and was right there with us. Very powerful to me.
I love that as an idea, and as a manifestation, as you say, in your work and in the gallery. The last question I often ask artists is, what has been the response to your work, and how have you received that? What has it meant to you? But actually, I'm going to close out because we have some of these responses in the chat, and you may have been too focused on answering questions to actually enjoy them. But I want to make sure before they go that you get to hear the appreciation for your work. And so I'm reading back through. Dawn saying amazing and powerful. Another powerful from Joanne. Chris saying beautiful work. And what a wonderful exhibition, gorgeous work to you, Blair. And then Moira too, a gorgeous for you. You have someone in the chat saying a Moira Bateman super fan here. Amy is saying to you, Moira, spectacular work for you, Moira. Very powerful exhibition and amazing work in art. And Jean McCurry talking about the shadows that you cast on the floors, walls, and ceilings of your pieces are a wonderful additional dimension. So I wanted to close out by just offering those appreciations from the audience. I know that there will be many more when people get to go, hopefully when the snow dissipates, to see your exhibitions and really spend time there. I want to say thank you very much for allowing me to be your interlocutor. It's been such a joy and a privilege to be able to talk about your work with you this evening. And I'm going to hand back to Tracy so that she can close us out on behalf of the Textile Center.
Michelle, I just made a note about interlocutor, because I've been like, okay, are you the moderator? Are you a curator? You know, anyway, thank you so much. And I want to say, okay, the exhibitions are up through April 8th. And one of the fabulous things about doing a discussion at this time is that folks still have plenty of time to come in and see the exhibitions. And I want you both to know, Blair and Moira, that we have had more foot traffic to see this exhibition than ever. And I think it has to do, you know, there were some strategies to the installation, and they were for good reason. And so, you know, we have a really wonderful guest book that we'll share with you. And it's the same kind of outpouring of just, I'm going to say, love and appreciation for your work. I think the audience gets the idea. Both of your bodies of work are very, very different. But in terms of working with the two of you together as fellows, it's been an absolute pleasure this year. You've tapped into my thinking about the field and about art and about life in general, both in very, very different ways. And I think that your work at the Textile Center continues to do that to the audience, to everyone that visits. So we have very, very much appreciation for the work that you did this past year. And Michelle, thank you for being such an absolute fabulous critic, visitor, moderator. I know that the fellows both, you know, immensely enjoyed connecting with you, and, you know, you're sort of down to earth, you know, just conversant style of helping them both relate their work to things that are really, really important in the world, and the art world is a big part of what we do. We try to do for the fellows in this program. So I think with that said, we are going to wrap this up with thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us this evening. And like I said, the session has been recorded. We will do a little bit of finessing to the beginning and the end of it, and then get it onto our website, because I think these kind of sessions are really, really fantastic, inspirational tools, teaching tools, resources for the fellows, even the curators and critics that have joined us. So I want to say, you know, on behalf of the Textile Center and all the staff I work with, and the McKnight Foundation, who I'm, you know, so honored to work with, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Okay.
Thank
All
you,
right.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, Blair. Bye, Moira, but not for
Bye.
long.
Thank
See
you
you
so much.
soon. Bye.